1 year after the Rim Massacre, the galaxy was a different place. The Vraxith Dominion existed only on their homeworld. Their fleet was gone. Their hive stations were ash. Their colonial infrastructure had been reduced to nothing. They still breathed and bred and built their organic towers on the surface of their planet, but they could not leave. They would look up at the stars for generations and know that the stars were no longer theirs. The Galactic Concord Council was dissolved. The Great Hall on Tyvellan Prime, where species had gathered for millennia to debate and negotiate and quietly betray each other, stood empty. The lights still worked, and the ventilation system still hummed, but no one sat on the raised platforms anymore. The 3 permanent seats that had represented unquestioned authority for longer than most species could remember were just empty chairs in an empty room. The Velithari had lost 70% of their fleet. Their swarm tactics, which had alien ventures sent against their prime, were bred to death. They began to wage wars. Terrorized lesser species for thousands of years had been proven useless against Terran technology. Their military was reduced to system defense ships, only enough to patrol their own borders, but never enough to threaten anyone else again. The Amduri retreated to their gas giant homeworlds and went quiet. Their massive capital ships, the ones that had survived the battle, were decommissioned. Their projections stopped appearing at diplomatic gatherings. They simply withdrew from galactic affairs, as if they were embarrassed by what they had been part of. The Shelvan endured, as they always had. Crystallark Doom was still alive, because beings made of living crystal did not die easily. But he was diminished. His authority was gone. His people's military was broken. His ancient voice, which had once commanded the attention of 1,000 species, now echoed in chambers where no one listened. He requested a meeting with Fleet Marshal Ayumi Tanaka. She agreed. Tyvellan Prime, in a small conference room, far from the empty Great Hall. Doom's crystalline body still caught the light of the dying star, but the glow seemed dimmer now, as if the star itself was tired of illuminating failures. Tanaka sat across from him and waited. She was patient. She had learned that patience was the most devastating weapon of all. I have existed for 4 million years, Doom said, and his voice was slower than she remembered, as if each word cost him something. I have watched species rise from nothing and fall back into dust. I have seen wars that burned across entire galactic arms, and I have seen peace that lasted for 10,000 years. He paused, and the crystals that made up his face shifted in a way that might have been sadness. In all that time, he continued, I have never seen what your species did. I have never seen fury so cold and precise. I have never seen grief turned into such perfect destruction. He leaned forward and asked the question that had to be answered. Been forming in his ancient mind for months. Was this proportionate? Tanaka looked at him, and her dark eyes did not blink. Her face did not change. And when she spoke, her voice was level and calm and utterly without mercy. You traded 157 million lives for convenience. You called our worlds acceptable concessions. You locked our ships down and blinded our communications so we could not even fight back. You silenced our ambassador so she could not scream while our children burned. You sat in your hidden chamber and voted unanimously to sacrifice an entire species because it was easier than fighting. She stood up from her chair. Do not speak to me about proportion. She left the room, and Doom sat alone with the dying light of the star. And for the first time in 4 million years, the ancient being had nothing to say. The collapse of the elder race's power created a vacuum that the galaxy rushed to fill. That had been subjugated or marginalized or simply ignored by the Concord for centuries began to assert their independence. The Telari, who had been forced to pay tribute to the Velithari for 800 years, declared their sovereignty. The Mundari, who had been denied council membership 17 times, announced that they no longer wanted it. The Fex Collective, which had been used as a buffer state between the elder race's territories, dissolved its forced alliance and reformed as an independent federation. The old order was gone, and everyone knew it. Earth stepped into the void, but not in the way the galaxy expected. Fleet Marshal Tanaka and Ambassador Vasquez worked together to create something new. They called it the Terran Accord, and it was built on a single principle that was written into its founding document in every known language. No species will be sacrificed for the comfort of another. The Accord was not an empire. It was not a hegemony, demand, tribute, or obedience, or submission. Membership was voluntary, and any species could leave at any time. But the terms of membership were non-negotiable. If you joined, you agreed to defend every other member. If you were attacked, the entire Accord responded. If you betrayed a fellow member, you were expelled, and you faced the consequences alone. 46 species attended the first session of the Terran Accord. Many of them were small species that had never had a voice in galactic affairs before. They sat in a chamber that was designed to have no raised platforms, no hierarchy, no permanent seats. Everyone sat at the same level because Tanaka had insisted on it. "We will not become what they were," she told Vasquez the night before the first session. "If we build another Concord, then everything we did was for nothing." The surviving colonies were rebuilt slowly and painfully. Refugee families returned to worlds that were scarred and broken, and they planted new crops in soil still tasted like ash. They built new homes on the foundations of old ones, and they raised children who would grow up knowing what had happened and why. On each of the 14 worlds, a memorial was constructed. Each one was different, reflecting the character of the colony it honored. On Harvest's End, the memorial was a vast field of golden grain that was never harvested and simply grew and waved in the wind forever. On Meridian's Gate, there was a statue of Captain Sarah Chen, standing at her console, still firing, still fighting, still calling for help. On New Carthage, the memorial was a wall. It was made of black stone, polished so smooth that it reflected the sky. And carved into that stone were names. Every single name. Every person who had died when the Vraxif came. 157 million names total across all 14 worlds. The New Carthage section alone contained 17,700,000 names, and the wall stretched from the ruins of the old capital to the edge of the Northern Sea. It took 3 years to engrave all the names. Teams of artisans worked day and night, carving each letter by hand, because the survivors had insisted that machines would not be enough, that every name deserved to be carved by a human hand. Admiral Conrad Mueller was relieved of command, at his own request, 1 year after the battle. He had done what needed to be done, and now the doing was finished, and he needed to go home. But home was New Carthage, and New Carthage was not the same. He took a transport to the surface, and he walked through the rebuilt capital, and he saw the new buildings and the new streets, and the children playing in parks that had been built over rubble. And he kept walking until he reached the memorial wall. He stood before it and looked at the names. The wall rose above him, 10 meters tall, and it stretched to the horizon in both directions. 17,700,000 names, and every single one of them was a person who had been alive and had laughed and had eaten breakfast and had worried about small things and had loved someone. He reached into his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. The paper was worn thin from months of being pinned to the wall of his quarters on the Prometheus. The names of the 14 colonies were written on it, in his own handwriting, smudged and faded, but still readable. He placed the paper at the base of the wall, and he stepped back, and he saluted, and he held the salute for a long time, and then the tears came, and he let them fall, because there was no one left to be strong for. 3 days later, Ambassador Ilara Vasquez stood at the podium of the Terran Accord's first formal assembly. 46 species watched her and waited. She was not the same woman who had stood in the Great Hall of Tyvellen Prime years ago, full of hope and trust. That woman was gone, burned away by betrayal and months of darkness in a cell, and the knowledge that her optimism had been used as a weapon against her own people. But something had grown in the place where that woman had been. Something harder and clearer and more honest. She gripped the podium, and she looked out at the representatives of 46 species, and she spoke. We came to the stars looking for friends. We extended our hand in peace, and we asked only to be treated as equals. We served the Concord faithfully. We bled for species that were not our own. We protected worlds that were not ours. We did this because we believed that kindness was strength, and that trust was the foundation of civilization. Her voice was steady, and it carried to every corner of the chamber. We were wrong. Trust is not a foundation. It is a gift, and we gave that gift to beings who saw it as weakness, who calculated that our kindness meant we would accept anything, who traded our worlds and our people for their own comfort. She paused, and the chamber was silent. Let this be the lesson we teach and the lesson we never forget. Humanity will extend its hand in peace. We will build and protect and serve alongside any species that stands with us in good faith. But if you take that hand and use it to pull us into the fire, she looked directly into the recording devices that would broadcast her words to every corner of the galaxy. We will burn the fire itself to ash. The chamber erupted in applause from 46 species, and Ilara stood at the podium and did not smile because this was not a moment for smiling. This was a promise, and promises were sacred things, and humanity had learned the hard way what happened when promises were broken. Far away on the surface of New Carthage, the wind blew across the memorial wall, and the names of the dead gleamed in the sunlight. And the piece of paper that Admiral Mueller had left at its base fluttered gently, but did not blow away. It stayed right where it was, as if the dead themselves were, holding it down. The Vraxith garrison commander, above New Carthage, was in the middle of reviewing hive expansion reports, when his sensor officer made a sound that no Vraxith had ever made before. It was a sound of pure terror. "What is it?" the commander demanded. The sensor officer pointed at the display with a trembling claw. 412 contacts had just appeared out of nowhere. No slip space signatures, no advance warning. One moment, the space around New Carthage was empty, and the next moment, it was filled with warships. Terran warships. The commander stared at the display, and his mandibles clicked in confusion. "That is impossible. No fleet can exit slip space without a transition signature," he said. He was still saying it was impossible when the first Cascade disruptor beam hit his flagship, and the molecular bonds holding the ship together simply stopped working. The vessel did not explode. It did not break apart. It dissolved. The metal and organic compounds that made up the vessel, bioships, separated into individual molecules and drifted apart like dust in a wind. The entire bridge crew watched their hull turn to nothing around them, and then they were floating in space, and then they were dead. Admiral Conrad Mueller stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and watched the Vraxith garrison fleet come apart. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no joy, just the cold mechanical focus of a man doing work that needed to be done. "All ships weapons free," he said. "Leave nothing." The Terran Vanguard fleet tore through the 400 Vraxith ships like a blade through smoke. The Null Lance batteries punched through bioship hulls as if they were made of paper. Quantum lock torpedoes phased through armor and detonated inside reactor cores and engine rooms. The Vraxith tried to return fire, but their weapons splashed harmlessly against Terran shield systems that operated on principles the hive species could not even comprehend. 11 minutes. It took 11 minutes to destroy 400 warships. The crew of the Prometheus did not cheer. There was nothing to cheer about. This was not victory. This was the beginning of repayment, and the debt was very, very large. Colony by colony, world by world, Muller's vanguard fleet swept through the Rim corridor. Every Vraxith ship, every hive station, every orbital structure was targeted and destroyed with surgical precision. The Terran AI networks coordinated the fleet's movements with a level of efficiency that no living commander could match. Every shot was calculated, every maneuver was optimized, every engagement was over before the Vraxith could mount a meaningful response. On the surfaces of the occupied colonies, Terran ground forces deployed in Titan-class exosuits. Each suit was 3 meters tall, powered by a microfusion core, and armed with plasma cutters and kinetic hammers that could crack through hive resin like glass. The Vraxith had burrowed deep into the ruins of human cities, building their tunnels and egg chambers in the basements of apartment buildings and the foundations of schools. The ground forces went in after them. Tunnel by tunnel, chamber by chamber, they cleared the hive structures. They found human remains in some of those tunnels, bones mixed into the resin walls, and they did not stop, and they did not hesitate, and they did not show mercy. On New Carthage, a young sergeant named Diego Ortiz led his squad into a hive tunnel beneath what had once been the capital's central hospital. They found a chamber where the Vraxith had used human infrastructure to build a birthing pool. The walls were covered in a thick organic membrane, and the floor was covered in eggs. Ortiz looked at the eggs, and then he looked at the name on his suit's shoulder patch, which read, New Carthage 3rd Volunteers, and he gave the order, and the plasma cutters turned the chamber into ash. The Vraxith Dominion realized they were losing. Not slowly, not gradually, but completely, and all at once. Their bioships could not match the Terran weapons. Their hive warriors could not stop the ground forces. Their commanders could not predict the Terran fleet's movements, because the AI networks changed tactics faster than any organic mind could follow. For the first time in their species' history, the Vraxith sent a surrender signal. It was broadcast on every frequency, a simple repeating pulse that meant we yield in their language. Fleet Marshal Ayumi Tanaka received the signal on the command ship Artemis. She read the translation, and she sat quietly for a moment, and then she opened a channel that broadcast on every frequency in the sector. You consumed our worlds, she said. You built your hives on the graves of our children. You ate our cities, and nested in our ruins. Surrender is for those who leave something worth saving. You left us nothing, and so we leave you nothing. She closed the channel, and the fleet pushed forward into Vraxith core space. The Vraxith homeworld was a massive planet, covered in organic structures that pulsed and breathed like a living thing. The Hive fleet made its last stand in orbit, and it was the largest concentration of Vraxith ships ever assembled. And it did not matter. The Terran fleet cut through them in 6 hours. Then Tanaka held position above the homeworld, and the Vraxith waited for the end. But the bombardment did not come. Tanaka chose not to glass the Vraxith homeworld. She destroyed every ship, every station, every orbital structure, every means of leaving the planet. But the planet itself she left intact. The Vraxith would survive, but they would not leave their world again for centuries. They were grounded permanently, reduced from a galactic power to prisoners of their own gravity. With the Vraxith finished, Mueller turned the Vanguard fleet toward Council space. The response from the Galactic Concord was immediate and outraged. Crystallarch Duum transmitted an official condemnation of what he called Terran aggression and demanded an immediate ceasefire. The irony of the ancient being who had signed away 14 human worlds, now demanding peace, was not lost on anyone. The Velithari and Amduri mobilized their combined fleets, 6,000 warships drawn from 3 species, each one crewed by beings who believed they were the rightful rulers of the galaxy. They formed a massive blockade across the approaches to Council space, and they waited. Tanaka did not slow down. She split the Vengeance fleet into 3 strike groups. The first, under Mueller, would hold the rim and ensure no Varaxith remnants could regroup. The second targeted the Council's communication network, every relay, every beacon, every Ansible station that connected the vast Concord infrastructure. The strike was coordinated down to the millisecond, and it took exactly 45 seconds to cut every communication line in Council space. 6,000 warships in the blockade suddenly could not talk to each other, could not coordinate, could not receive orders. The third strike group, led by Tanaka herself, arrived at Tivelin Prime. The Battle of Tivelin Prime was the largest space engagement in recorded galactic history. 6,000 Council warships against 800 Terran vessels. The numbers favored the Council by nearly 8-1. It did not matter. The Velithari fought with swarm tactics, thousands of small, fast ships attacking from every direction. The Terran AI networks tracked every single one simultaneously, and the point defense systems cut them down like rain hitting a window. The Amduri brought their massive capital ships, each one the size of a small moon, and the Null Lance batteries cored through them one by one, leaving hollow burning shells drifting in space. The Shelvan fired their ancient crystalline energy weapons, beautiful beams of light that had destroyed civilizations long before humanity existed, and the Terran shields absorbed them without flickering. 9 hours. The battle lasted 9 hours. The Council lost 4,200 ships. The Terran fleet lost 340. When it was over, the space around Tivelin Prime was filled with wreckage and silence. Mueller docked the Prometheus at Tivelin Prime, and he walked through the corridors of the station with a squad of Marines until he found the detention level. He found the door that had been locked from the outside for 6 months, and he opened it. Ambassador Ilara Vasquez stood up from the small bed in the corner of her cell. She was thin, and her hair had gone white at the temples, and there was a scar across her left cheek that had not been there before. She looked at Mueller, and her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. "Conrad," she said. "Ilara," he said, "it is over." He brought her to the bridge of the Prometheus, and she stood at the viewport and looked out at the burning remains of the Council fleet. The wreckage stretched in every direction as far as she could see. Thousands of shattered ships from 3 species that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years, reduced to scrap metal and drifting crystal and fading light. She stood there for a long time, and she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The refugee ships began arriving at Earth's orbit on a Tuesday, and they did not stop coming for 3 weeks. They came in battered transports and overloaded cargo haulers and civilian shuttles that were never designed for long-distance travel. They came with hull breaches sealed by emergency foam and engines held together with prayers and desperation. They came carrying 31 million survivors out of 188 million souls who had once called the Rim Corridor home. The people of Earth watched the ships arrive, and they watched the footage that the survivors brought with them, the burning of New Carthage, the silence of Harvest's End, the last stand of Captain Sarah Chen on Meridian's Gate. They watched Governor Tomas Reyes give his seat to a mother and her twins, and stand alone on the landing pad as the fire came down. They watched all of it, and something changed. There were no riots in the streets of Earth. There were no protests or political arguments or debates about what to do. Nations that had disagreed about everything for centuries looked at each other and saw the same cold, hard thing reflected in every pair of eyes. The arguments stopped. The divisions healed, not because people forgot their differences, but because their differences suddenly did not matter at all. The United Earth Parliament convened an emergency session, and the representatives filed into the great chamber in silence. There was no shouting, no passionate speeches, no theatrical displays of outrage. The Speaker of Parliament read the names of the 14 fallen colonies aloud, and when she finished, The chamber was so quiet that you could hear the ventilation system humming. Then she introduced the retribution mandate. The vote was unanimous. Every single representative from every single nation pressed their button at the same time. It was the first unanimous vote in the Parliament's 200-year history, and it would be the last. That day, there was nothing left to disagree about. Fleet Marshal Ayumi Tanaka was appointed Supreme Commander of the newly consolidated Terran Vengeance Fleet. She was a small woman with short gray hair and dark eyes that never seemed to blink. She had commanded Earth's home defense forces for 15 years, and she had a reputation for being the kind of officer who never raised her voice because she never needed to. She stood before the assembled fleet commanders in the war room beneath the Parliament building, and she looked at each of them in turn. The council calculated that we would grieve, she said. They calculated that we would send angry messages and make demands, and eventually accept what happened, because what choice did we have? They calculated that we were young and weak, and that young, weak species do as they are told. She paused, and the silence was absolute. They do not understand what we are. Then she told them the secret, and even the fleet. Commanders who had served for decades stared at her with wide eyes. Humanity had been sandbagging. The ships that Earth had committed to the Galactic Concord were second-line vessels. Good ships, solid ships, but not the best. Not even close. The best ships had never left the Sol system. They had been built in secret in the deep shipyards carved into the ice of Titan, and the rocky moons of Jupiter, and the frozen stations scattered through the Oort cloud. The Terran Expeditionary Armada that the Council knew about numbered 800 warships. The real fleet, the one that Earth had been building quietly for 4 decades, numbered 2,400 warships, and every single one of them was 2 generations more advanced than anything the galaxy had ever seen. There were weapons the Council did not know existed. Cascade disruptors that could unravel molecular bonds at a distance, turning solid metal into clouds of dust. Null lance batteries that fired concentrated beams of inverted energy capable of punching through any known shield technology like a finger through wet paper. Quantum lock torpedoes that could phase through hull plating and detonate inside a ship's reactor core. There were drive systems that the Council scientists would have said were impossible. Terran engineers had cracked the theoretical barriers 6 years ago and had been refining the technology in secret ever since. The new drives were 3 times faster than anything in the Concorde fleet, and they left no slipspace trail, which meant the enemy would not see them coming until they had already arrived. And then there were the AI networks. The Council had strict laws against advanced artificial intelligence. Every member species was required to limit their computational systems to certain approved levels. Humanity had smiled and nodded and agreed to these limits, and then had gone home and built the most sophisticated AI networks in galactic history. Shielded facilities, deep underground on Earth and Mars, and they had been running war simulations for years. Millions of scenarios, billions of variables, 10,000 simulations per second, every second of every day, for 6 straight years. The AI networks had predicted the Council's betrayal 2 years before it happened. The warning had been classified at the highest level and shared only with the Parliament's Inner Security Council. It was the reason the secret fleet existed. It was the reason the advanced weapons had been developed. It was the reason humanity had never fully committed its best technology to the Concorde. Some part of humanity had always known that the galaxy could not be trusted, and that quiet part had been preparing. Admiral Mueller arrived at Earth with the remnants of the Expeditionary Armada. His ships were battered, and his crews were exhausted, and he had not slept in weeks. He walked into the war room, and Fleet Marshal Tanaka showed him the real fleet. He sat down heavily in a chair and put his face in his hands. "How long?" he asked. 3 months to full deployment, Tanaka said. "We need to retrofit the expeditionary ships with the new weapon systems and integrate the AI targeting networks." 3 months. Mueller lifted his head, and his eyes were red. Every day we wait is a day they spend fortifying our worlds, building hive structures on the bones of our cities. I know, Tanaka said, but when we go at full strength. We do not give them a battle. We give them an extinction. Mueller looked at her for a long time, and then he nodded. He returned to the Prometheus, and he went to his quarters, and he took a sheet of paper, and he wrote the names of every fallen colony on it. New Carthage, and Harvest's End, and Meridian's Gate, and all the others, all 14 of them. He pinned the paper to the wall above his bed. He did not sleep anymore. He did not need to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw fire falling from the sky, and heard Governor Reyes telling a mother to take his seat, and heard Captain Chen's voice calling for help that never came. The Prometheus protocol was activated across the Sol system. Civilian factories converted to military production in days. Assembly lines that had been making agricultural equipment began producing torpedo casings and armor plating. Shipyards that built commercial transports began fitting weapons hardpoints and shield generators. Every human in the Sol system knew what was coming, and every single one of them wanted to help. Engineers worked double shifts. Pilots trained around the clock. Scientists refined weapon systems until they were perfect, and then refined them again. The intelligence division worked day and night, pulling apart every piece of data they had on the Council and the Vraxith. They found the treaty document, the one signed in the hidden chamber on Tyvelin Prime. They decrypted it and read it, and the words, "acceptable territorial concessions," were circled and highlighted and distributed to every ship in the fleet, so that every crew member could see exactly what the galaxy thought of them. Fleet Marshal Tanaka stood on the observation deck of the orbital command station above Earth, and looked down at the planet below, and then out at the fleet assembling in formation around it. 2,400 warships, bristling with weapons that the galaxy had never imagined. She thought about Crystallark Duum, and his ancient voice, saying the Concord remembers its debts. Yes, she whispered to the empty room, and so do we. The fleet was ready. Earth had stopped grieving. Earth had started planning. 6 weeks later, the sky above New Carthage turned the color of blood, and Governor Tomas Reyes knew something was terribly wrong. He had been in his office reviewing agricultural reports when the first alarm sounded. It was not the usual drill tone. This was the deep pulsing warning that meant orbital threat detected, and in 20 years of governing New Carthage, he had never heard it sound for real. He ran to the command center and found his staff already gathered around the sensor displays. Their faces were pale. "What is it?" he demanded. "Vraxith bioships, sir," his defense chief said. "Over 200 of them. They just dropped out of slip space directly inside our defense perimeter." Inside the perimeter, Reyes felt his stomach drop. "That is impossible. They would need our exact defense grid coordinates to do that." Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. "Get me the Council peacekeeping fleet in orbit," Reyes ordered. "They have 6 heavy cruisers up there. Tell them we need immediate support." His communications officer worked the console, and then looked up with confusion in her eyes. "Sir, the Council ships are responding, but they say they have received orders to hold position and observe. They say they are not authorized to engage." "Not authorized?" Reyes grabbed the edge of the console so hard his knuckles went white. "There are 200 enemy warships above my planet, and they are not authorized to engage." The first Vraxith bombardment hit the southern continent, and the shockwave was visible from space. At the same moment across the galaxy, every Terran warship docked at a Concord station found its navigation systems locked down. Council technicians had uploaded override codes that froze the human ships in place like insects caught in amber. Crews shouted and cursed and tried to bypass the lockouts, but the codes were buried deep in the shared operating systems that the Council had insisted all member species use. It had been a requirement of membership, and now it was a trap. The Terran communication relays that ran through Council infrastructure went dark simultaneously. Every message, every distress call, every cry for help was swallowed by silence. The humans were cut off from each other, blind and deaf and alone. On Tyvelin Prime, Ambassador Ilara Vasquez was in her quarters when 6 Shelvan security officers appeared at her door. Their crystalline bodies blocked the hallway, and their weapons were drawn. "Ambassador, you are being placed under protective custody for your own safety," the lead officer said. "Protective custody?" Ilara stared at them. "What is happening? Tell me what is happening." They did not answer. They took her datapad and her communication devices, and they led her to a small room deep inside the station, with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. But Ilara was not a fool. Secondary transmitter in the lining of her jacket, a precaution she had taken years ago because some small part of her had never fully trusted the galaxy. She pulled it out and sent a single burst transmission on a frequency the Council did not monitor, aimed directly at the deep space relay closest to Earth. The message was short. "It is a setup. They sold us." Then the Shelvan found the transmitter and took it, and the door closed, and Ilara was alone in the dark. On New Carthage, Governor Reyes ordered a full evacuation. He knew the math. 22 million people, and not enough transport ships to carry even a quarter of them. But he would save who he could. The evacuation centers filled within hours. Families carried children and bags and the things they thought mattered most, until they realized that nothing mattered except getting on a ship. Reyes stood in the main spaceport and directed traffic and kept his voice calm even though the ground shook every few minutes from orbital strikes. The Vraxith bioships cracked the planet's crust in the southern hemisphere, and magma began to pour across the surface like rivers of fire. The sky turned black with ash, and the temperature began to climb. 4,300,000 people made it off New Carthage before the last transport ship launched. Governor Reyes was not on it. He had given his seat to a woman carrying twin infants, and he stood on the landing pad and watched the ship rise into the burning sky, and he did not look away, even when the heat became unbearable. 17,700,000 people died on New Carthage that day, and it was only the first world to fall. On Harvest's End, an agricultural colony of 3 million people, the population had no warning at all. The Vraxith arrived and began bombardment, and the farmers and workers and children looked up at the sky and saw fire falling and did not even understand what was happening. Ships in orbit. No defense grid. No evacuation plan. The Council had classified Harvest's End as a low-priority world and had never approved the construction of orbital defenses. The planet burned in 4 hours. On Meridian's Gate, the colonists fought back. A retired Terran naval officer named Captain Sarah Chen organized the orbital defense platforms and managed to destroy 19 Vraxith ships before the High Fleet overwhelmed them. She broadcast on every open frequency, begging anyone who could hear her to send help. The Council ships monitoring the system recorded her transmissions and filed them and did nothing. Chen died when her platform was rammed by a Vraxith dreadnought. She was still firing when the hull breached. Colony after colony, the story repeated. 14 worlds along the Rim Corridor, each one attacked with perfect knowledge of its defenses, its weaknesses, its evacuation routes. The Vraxith knew where every orbital battery was aimed. They knew where every sensing base was. Civilian shelter was hidden. They knew everything because the Council had given them everything. 157 million people died in 3 weeks. Admiral Conrad Muller was 3 weeks of travel away when the first fragmented distress calls reached him through back-channel frequencies that the Council had not thought to shut down. He stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and listened to the recordings, and his face became something that his crew had never seen before. It was not anger, Not yet. Anger would come later. What they saw on his face was the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the universe had just been torn apart and rebuilt into something darker. He tried to regroup his scattered fleet, but Council ships actively blocked his movements. Two of his destroyers, the Resolute and the Burning Star, were destroyed by what the Velithari later called accidental friendly fire. The Velithari cruisers that killed them made no attempt to apologize. Muller stood in front of the main communication array and recorded a message. He sent it on every Terran frequency, military and civilian, encoded and open, priority 0, which meant nothing in the galaxy matters more than this. All ships, all hands. This is Admiral Conrad Muller, commanding officer of the Terran Expeditionary Armada. Abort all current missions. Disengage from all Council operations. Abandon all Concord stations. If Council forces attempt to stop you, fight through them. I repeat, fight through them. Come home, now. He paused and his jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and hard. They betrayed us. They gave our worlds to the enemy. They killed our people. They will answer for this. Every last one of them will answer. He ended the transmission and turned to his navigation officer. Set course for Sol, maximum speed. Sir, that will burn out the drive cores. I said maximum speed. Home, and behind it, the rim corridor burned, and the stars themselves seemed to look away in shame. Ambassador Ilara Vasquez stood at the tall glass window of her quarters on Tyvelin Prime and watched the dying star below paint everything in shades of deep orange and red. She had spent 10 years on this station, and still, the view made her chest feel tight with something close to wonder. The station itself was a ring the size of a small moon, built around that ancient star by species who had been traveling the stars long before humans learned to make fire. Ilara reminded herself of that every morning because it helped her stay humble, and humility was the one thing the elder races seemed to respect. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord Council 42 years ago, after decades of careful diplomacy and a willingness to do the jobs nobody else wanted to do. When border conflicts broke out on the dangerous rim territories, it was always the humans who volunteered their ships and soldiers. The elder species nodded and said thank you, and gave humanity a junior seat at the Great Council table, and Ilara had spent her career trying to turn that junior seat into something more. She tapped the communication panel on her desk, and the face of Admiral Conrad Muller appeared on the screen. He looked tired, which was not unusual these days. His flagship, the ISV Prometheus, was stationed 3 weeks of travel away from Earth, and his fleet was spread across 5 different conflict zones, all at the Council's request. How are the deployments going? Ilara asked. Muller rubbed his jaw and sighed. We are thin, Ilara. Too thin. I have ships babysitting trade routes for the Amduri, and running patrol lanes for the Velithari, and doing border security for the Shelvan. And I barely have enough left to cover our own colonies on the rim. I know, she said, but this is how we prove ourselves. The Council watches everything we do. And what exactly are they doing for us in return? Muller asked. Ilara did not answer that question, because she did not have a good answer, and they both knew it. The next morning, the Council called an emergency session, and Ilara walked into the great hall with her back straight and her datapad ready. The hall was enormous, with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. The 3 permanent members sat on raised platforms at the center. The Velithari representative was an insectoid creature, with compound eyes that reflected light like broken mirrors. The Amduri ambassador appeared as a shimmering projection, since the gas giant dwellers could never survive in a solid atmosphere. And at the highest platform sat Crystallarch Duum, the High Arbiter of the Shelvan, a being made of living crystal who was older than most civilizations. The topic was the Vraxith Dominion. Ilara had read the intelligence reports. The Vraxith were a hive species from the far edge of the galaxy, aggressive and expansionist, and they were pushing inward fast. They had already consumed 3 uninhabited systems, and their bioships were unlike anything the Concord had faced before. They did not build their vessels, they grew them. The Vraxith represent a clear and immediate danger to the stability of the galactic rim, Crystallark Duum said, and his voice sounded like stones grinding together, deep and ancient. We must discuss our response. Ilara stood when it was her turn to speak. She looked up at the 3 elder species, and she felt small, but she spoke clearly. Earth pledges its full support to the Concord's defense efforts against the Vraxith. We will commit additional ships and personnel to the Rim Patrol corridors. In return, we ask that the Council honor the Mutual Defense Pact. If the Vraxith target human colonies, we expect the full protection of the Concord fleet. The hall was quiet for a moment. Then Crystallark Duum leaned forward, and the light from the dying star caught his crystalline body and made it glow like a lantern. The Concord remembers its debts, Ambassador Vasquez. Humanity has served faithfully. You will not stand alone. Ilara felt relief wash through her like cool water. She nodded and thanked the High Arbiter and returned to her seat, and she believed every word he had said, because she had spent 10 years building this trust, and she could not imagine it was built on nothing. She was wrong. 3 hours after the public session ended, a private meeting took place in a chamber that existed on no official map of Tyvelin Prime. The 3 elder species gathered without any junior members present. The room was shielded against every form of surveillance known to galactic science. The Velithari representative clicked her mandibles in agitation. The Vraxith have made contact directly. They are not interested in total war. They want territory. Specific territory. The Amduri projection flickered. Which territory? The human colonies on the rim, the Velithari said. All 14 worlds. They want the corridor and everything in it. Silence filled the room. Crystallark Duum was still for a long time. The ancient being had watched species rise and fall for millions of years. He had seen empires crumble and stars die, and he had learned long ago that survival was a matter of mathematics, not morality. What do the Vraxith offer in exchange? He asked. A 300-year non-aggression pact, the Velithari answered. They will not advance beyond the Rim corridor. They will leave all elder species territories untouched. They want only the human worlds. The Amduri spoke, and its voice was like wind moving through deep canyons. The humans have served us well. Giving up their worlds would be a violation of everything the Concord claims to stand for. The Concord claims many things, Crystallark Duum replied. But the Concord survives because we make difficult choices. The Vraxith fleet outnumbers our combined forces. If we fight, we lose thousands of ships and millions of lives across dozens of species. If we give them what they want, we lose 14 worlds belonging to one species. A young species, a species that has been part of the Concord for barely a single generation. You are talking about 188 million people, the Amduri said. I am talking about the survival of the Concord itself, Doom answered. The Velithari clicked rapidly, which was a sign of agreement among her kind. The humans are useful, but they are replaceable. They breed quickly, they adapt, they will recover. We will offer them resettlement programs and express our deep regret, and in 100 years, this will be a footnote in the archives. The Amduri projection dimmed, which was the equivalent of closing one's eyes in grief. And if the humans do not accept this peacefully? Crystallark Doom turned his ancient crystalline gaze toward the Amduri, and the light inside him was cold. They will not be given the chance to refuse. Voted, and the vote was unanimous, and the document they produced referred to the 14 human colony worlds as acceptable territorial concessions, and it was signed in a language that humans could not read, in a room that humans did not know existed. And 3 floors above that hidden chamber, Ambassador Elara Vasquez sat in her quarters and drafted a message to Earth, telling them that the Council had promised to stand with humanity, and that the Alliance was stronger than ever, and that the future looked bright. She sent the message with a smile on her face. She did not know that the knife was already at her back.